The lights were blinding. The audience was loud. Cameras flashed, makeup glistened, and every contestant before her had entered with big dreams and confident smiles. But then, in the middle of that glittering stage, silence fell, because a small, trembling voice had just asked something no one in that studio expected to hear. "If I sing well, will you give me a plate of food?" The question hung in the air like a dropped pin in a cathedral. The crowd didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or clap. One judge leaned forward, frowning as if he'd misheard. Another blinked repeatedly, mouth slightly open. The host froze mid-smile, his cue card shaking slightly in his hand. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Some laughed awkwardly, assuming it was a joke. Others gasped, whispering, "Did she just say food?" But the girl, barefoot, wearing a torn yellow dress that looked 2 sizes too big, didn't laugh. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, clutching a cracked, old microphone like it was made of gold. Her name was Amora. She was just 12 years old. No fancy hairstyle, no glitter makeup, no parents cheering from backstage. Just a tiny figure under blinding lights, looking out at a sea of strangers who suddenly didn't know how to feel. Behind the stage, the producers exchanged nervous looks. This wasn't what the show was supposed to be. It was supposed to be fun, glamorous, entertaining. Not heartbreaking. The judge with a sharp tongue, the one famous for his brutal honesty, finally leaned toward his MIC. "Did you just ask for food?" he said, trying to sound gentle but failing. Amora nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. Just a plate of food. I haven't eaten since yesterday." You could have heard a pin drop. Outside the stage, her life was the complete opposite of this bright room. Every night, Amora slept on cardboard boxes behind a bakery that threw out unsold bread at dawn. Sometimes she'd sneak a few pieces before the dogs did. Other nights, she went to bed hungry. But even then, she sang, to herself, to the stars, to the empty streets. Her voice was her only blanket. For weeks, she had been peeking through the back window of that talent show building, watching other contestants practice. Some wore sparkly clothes, others had expensive microphones. She watched in silence, memorizing how they held the MIC, how they bowed, how they smiled. And then, one morning, something inside her simply said, "Go." She walked straight in through the front doors. The security guard tried to stop her. "No audition pass?" he asked. Amora looked up and said softly, "Please? I can sing. I just want a chance." Maybe it was her eyes, maybe her tone, but the guard hesitated. Then he handed her a sticker with a number on it. "Fine, kid. Don't say I never did anything good." That was how she ended up here, under the stage lights, trembling but determined. She wasn't there for fame. She wasn't there for money. She wasn't even there for a dream. She was there for survival. When the judge finally composed himself, he cleared his throat. "What song will you sing for us, Amora?" She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides 1,000 memories. Something my mama used to sing before she disappeared. The audience leaned forward. The cameraman zoomed in, focusing on her small hand shaking around the microphone. "Disappeared," one of the judges repeated softly. Amora nodded. "She went to the city to find work when I was 9. She said she'd be back soon, but she never came home." Someone in the crowd audibly gasped. The host swallowed hard, unsure if he should continue the show or stop it entirely. But Amora didn't seem broken. She seemed ready. She adjusted the MIC stand, which was too tall for her, with both hands. The way she handled it made it look like a sacred ritual. Her feet, dusty and bare, shuffled slightly to the center of the stage. Then she looked out into the blinding audience lights and whispered to herself, "For you, Mama." One of the judges instinctively pressed his hand together, as if in prayer. The pianist backstage placed his fingers on the keys, waiting for her nod. She gave it, slowly. A single note filled the air, soft, distant, almost like a heartbeat. And right before she began to sing, a strange stillness filled the entire room. You could sense it, that this was not going to be just another performance. Something about this moment felt eternal. The host glanced at the crowd, whispering, "Everyone, quiet. Just listen." And as Amora took a deep breath, Her eyes closed, and her trembling lips parted. The world held its breath. What happened next would not only silence the judges, it would change her life forever. The music started softly, a simple piano melody, fragile and slow, like a heartbeat struggling to be heard. The lights dimmed to a gentle gold as a crowd leaned forward, curious. Amora stood still, her small fingers gripping the microphone, eyes closed as if she were afraid to open them. Then, when she finally did, something in her gaze changed. It was like another soul had stepped into her tiny frame. Her lips parted, and a single note escaped, shaky and thin, but pure. The sound quivered in the air, uncertain for a second, before finding strength. And then she sang. Her voice wasn't perfect. It cracked, it trembled, but it carried something so real, so heartbreakingly human, that it pierced every soul in the room. Every note carried pain, hope, hunger, and something divine that no studio MIC could ever capture. She sang of lost mothers, of nights spent cold and alone, of promises whispered through hunger. She sang like someone who had nothing left but her voice, and she gave it all away in that moment. The audience, who had moments ago been whispering, now sat frozen. People who had come to laugh at another audition were now wiping tears. The cameraman forgot to zoom out. Even the judge, known for never showing emotion, the one famous for his biting remarks, was quietly wiping his eyes. The studio, once filled with noise and chatter, was now silent except for that small voice echoing like prayer. The melody rose, and with it, the story of her soul. It wasn't just a song. It was a confession, a cry for help, a message from forgotten child to the world that had ignored her. You could almost feel her pain vibrating through the air, shaking the lights, echoing in every heart that heard her. A woman in the audience covered her mouth to stop herself from sobbing. The host, standing by the side of the stage, blinked rapidly, his smile long gone. Even the camera operators, professionals who had seen 100 performances, lowered their equipment just to listen. Somewhere near the back, a man whispered, "My God, she's not just singing, she's surviving." And he was right. Amora wasn't performing for applause. She was fighting for her life, for one chance to be seen, to be fed, to be remembered. As the music swelled toward the final verse, her small voice carried like a choir of angels. The judges didn't move. No one dared to breathe too loudly, afraid to break the spell she had cast. Every syllable hit like truth, every pause like heartbreak. The final line trembled from her lips. "Come home, Mama." And for a split second, the sound seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. Then came silence. Not the awkward kind, but the sacred kind that follows something miraculous. The lights flickered softly over her face, showing tears streaked down her cheeks. She slowly lowered the microphone, her hands shaking. The entire auditorium rose to its feet in a standing ovation, but Amora barely reacted. She looked up toward the ceiling lights, whispered into the MIC, "That was for Mama," and then her body went limp. She collapsed right there on stage. The host gasped, dropping his cue cards, and rushed toward her. One of the judges jumped from their seat, yelling for the medic. The audience screamed. A woman near the front row fainted in shock. Cameras kept rolling, capturing what no one ever expected to see, a child who sang her soul out and fell before hearing the applause. Paramedics rushed in within seconds, kneeling beside her tiny frame. The host tried to keep his composure, his voice trembling as he said, "Please, everyone, stay calm," but even he sounded broken. They lifted Amora carefully, an oxygen mask pressed to her face. The crowd stayed standing, motionless, watching. Someone shouted, "Give her water." Another whispered, "Is she okay?" Minutes felt like hours. When they finally carried her offstage, one camera caught her barely whispering something, her lips moving softly. A sound engineer later played it back, amplifying her voice, and everyone in the control room fell silent. Her last word before being taken backstage were barely audible. Did I sing well enough for that plate of food?" One of the producers dropped his headset and turned away, tears streaming down his face. The clip spread like wildfire within hours. Across the world, people watched that moment, a barefoot girl with a voice like no other, fainting after singing for nothing more than a meal. But no one could shake that one haunting question that still echoed long after the music stopped. How hungry must a soul be to sing like that? That night, the world changed for Amora, though she didn't even know it yet. While she lay in a hospital bed, hooked up to Infor, her clip exploded across the internet like wildfire. Within 24 hours, it had reached over 50 million views. Every social media platform was flooded with hashtags, #Amora the Street Singer, #SingForHope, #APlayToFood. News anchors replayed the same haunting moment again and again. The barefoot girl on stage, singing with tears on her face, then collapsing into the arms of paramedics. Headlines screamed, "Starving girl sings her way into the world's heart," and the song that made a nation cry. But what the world didn't know, what no one could have guessed, was the truth behind that song. 3 years earlier, long before the cameras and the lights, Amora lived in a small village where the nights were peaceful and the mornings smelled of rain. Her mother, Layla, was a singer in the local church, a voice that could calm storms and lift spirits. Every Sunday, villagers gathered just to hear her sing. And when little Amora joined in, everyone would smile and whisper, "That child is her mother's soul." Life was simple then. They had little money, but they had love and music. Every night before bed, Layla would hum a lullaby, the same one she taught Amora to sing when she was scared of thunder. But one year, the thunder didn't stop. A powerful storm swept through their village, destroying their small wooden house and washing away everything they owned. The next morning, as the sun rose over the ruins, Layla made a promise. She looked at Amora and said softly, "I'll go to the city, my love. I'll find work, rebuild our home, and then I'll come back for you." Amora nodded, trusting her mother's warm eyes, not realizing that was the last time she would ever see her. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and then silence. No letters, no calls, no word from Layla. Amora stayed with neighbors for a while, waiting. Every day she would walk to the edge of the road, staring at passing buses, hoping to see her mother step out. But she never did. When the neighbors moved away, Amora had nowhere left to go. She began wandering from town to town, singing on sidewalks, in markets, and at bus stations for coins. Sometimes people stopped to listen. Sometimes they just walked past. She survived on leftover food and the memory of her mother's voice. That song she sang on stage, the one that made the world cry, wasn't just a song. It was a mother's lullaby. It was her last memory of love. The lyrics, simple but powerful, spoke of finding light in darkness, of waiting for someone who might never return. Every time she sang it on the streets, she felt like her mother could hear her, somewhere, somehow. And on that stage, with the cameras rolling, she poured every ounce of that longing into her performance. Backstage, as her story began to spread, one of the show's producers couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. "We have to find her mother," he told the host urgently. "If this girl sang that song for her, we owe it to her to try." Within hours, the production team launched a nationwide search. Posters were designed, social media campaigns started, and radio stations began playing clips of Amora's voice, asking listeners if they recognized the song or the name Layla. The story became a national mission. Reporters showed up at hospitals, orphanages, and churches across the country, searching for clues. Thousands of people called in with tips, some false, some hopeful. One woman claimed to have seen Layla singing in a city market years ago. Another swore she'd heard that same lullaby in a church near the coast. But every lead ended the same way, a dead end. Meanwhile, Amora remained in the hospital, recovering slowly. She didn't know about the search. The producers decided not to tell her yet. They didn't want to raise her hopes until they had something real. She spent her days quietly staring out the window, humming her mother's song to herself. Nurses brought her extra meals, fans sent flowers, and the show paid for her medical care. Still, she didn't smile much. The world called her a miracle, but she just felt empty because the person she wanted to hear her most wasn't there. Days passed. The excitement online began to fade. Reporters moved on to the next trending story. And just when the producers began to lose hope, the phone rang. It was a woman, her voice trembling, emotional. I know that song," she said. "My sister and I wrote it together years ago." The room went silent. The producer's hand tightened around the receiver. "Your sister?" he asked carefully. "Yes," the woman replied. "Her name is Layla." Everyone in the room froze. The producer covered the phone with his hand and whispered to the team, "I think we found her." But what they didn't know yet was that the truth they were about to uncover would be far more complicated and heartbreaking than any of them imagined. The phone call came in the middle of the night. The studio had gone quiet hours earlier, most of the staff asleep in their chairs after another long, hopeless day of searching. When the phone rang, the producer almost ignored it, assuming it was another false lead. But something in the caller's voice made him sit up straight. "My name is Miriam," the woman said softly, her tone trembling. I know that song. I wrote it years ago with my sister." The producer's pulse quickened. "Your sister's name?" he asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. There was a pause on the line. Then the woman whispered, "Layla." The room froze. Every person in that studio had heard that name dozens of times from Amora's story. And now, suddenly, it wasn't just a name from a little girl's memory. It was real. The producer's voice cracked as he said, "Please, can you come to the studio tomorrow? We need to talk to you." Miriam agreed. The next morning, Amora sat in a small waiting room at the studio, fidgeting with a corner of her hospital wristband. She'd been told someone wanted to meet her, someone who might know about her mother. Her stomach twisted with both hope and fear. She had been disappointed too many times before, told too many false stories by strangers who claimed to know where her mother was. So she tried to stay calm, telling herself not to believe anything until she saw proof. Then the door opened. A woman in her mid-40s stepped inside. Her hair was tied back in a bun, her face tired but kind, and her eyes were the same deep brown as Amora's. The moment they looked at each other, neither spoke. Amora's breath caught in her throat. Miriam took one step forward, her hand trembling, and whispered, "You look just like her, just like Layla." The air seemed to thicken. Slowly, Miriam knelt down and pulled Amora into a tight embrace. The little girl froze for a second, and then burst into tears, clutching the woman's dress as if afraid she might vanish too. When Miriam finally spoke, her voice was heavy with emotion. "Your mother never stopped looking for you," she said. "She searched every bus stop, every orphanage, every market. She thought you were gone forever, but she never gave up." Amora's tears flowed freely now. "Where is she?" she asked desperately. Miriam's smile faltered. Her lips trembled before she answered. "She fell ill last year, but she kept singing your song every night, saying it helped her feel close to you." Amora's hand shook. "Is she still alive?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Miriam hesitated. Her eyes glistened. Without saying a word, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn envelope. The edges were frayed, the paper yellowed by time. She handed it to Amora gently, as though it were made of glass. "She left this for you," Miriam said quietly. Amora opened it slowly. Inside was a faded hospital photograph, a woman lying in bed, smiling weakly at the camera. Her eyes were closed, but her hand was raised, as if blessing the child she would never see again. Beneath the photo was a small folded note, written in shaky handwriting that trembled across the page. "Keep singing, my star. When your voice reaches the world, I'll know you made it. Mama." The room fell silent. Cameras stopped rolling. The producers, the host, even the judges who had gathered nearby stood in stunned silence. Amora pressed the note to her chest as if it were A itself, as if letting go would mean losing her mother all over again. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but there was also something else in her expression, a quiet strength, a spark that hadn't been there before. Miriam wiped her own tears and whispered, "She would be so proud of you, Amora. You gave her song a second life." The host, who had been silent all this time, finally stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Amora's shoulder. "You know," he said softly, "the whole world heard you sing, but I think your mother was listening first." The audience, who had been watching from behind the glass panels, began to clap, slowly at first, then louder, until the room filled with applause and tears. But even in that powerful moment, Amora didn't cry out in joy or collapse in despair. She just stood there, clutching the note, her lips moving in silent prayer. Because deep down, she knew the story wasn't over. Her mother's body might have grown weak, but her words, "Keep singing, my star," had given her a new purpose. As the camera prepared to roll again, Amora turned to Miriam and said quietly, "If she could hear me now, I want her to know I'll never stop singing." Miriam nodded, smiling through her tears. "Then let the world hear what she taught you," she replied. No one knew what Amora was about to do next. The crew thought she might rest. The producers thought the story had reached its emotional end. But they were wrong, because what Amora did next would shock not just the studio, but the entire nation watching. The night of the talent show finale was unlike anything the country had ever seen. Every seat in the grand hall was taken. Every camera focused on the small stage that had become a symbol of hope. Outside, thousands gathered around screens and speakers, waiting to hear the little girl who had once asked only for a plate of food. When the lights dimmed and her name was announced, the roar of the crowd was deafening. Then, slowly, out walked Amora, stronger, taller, her face glowing with quiet confidence. She was dressed in a bright white gown, soft and shimmering under the lights, donated by a famous designer who had been touched by her story. Gone were the rags and bare feet. Now she walked with grace, her head held high. But her eyes still carried the same humble spark that had captured the world's heart. The audience cheered, but Amora lifted a hand gently, signaling for silence. The music hadn't started yet. She had something to say. The crowd hushed instantly, the air thick with anticipation. "I came here for food," she began softly, her voice trembling just enough to remind everyone that she was still that same little girl from the streets. "But now, I sing for every child who's still hungry, for every mama who's still missing, and for everyone who ever thought they weren't enough." The crowd was silent, completely still, hanging on to every word. "This song," she continued, "was the last thing my mother sang to me before she disappeared. And tonight, I'll sing it again. For her, and for all of you who helped me find her." The conductor lifted his baton, and the orchestra began, a slow, rising melody that filled the hall like a sunrise. Amora closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then, with her heart in her throat, she began to sing her mother's lullaby one final time. But this time, it was different. Her voice was no longer weak or trembling. It was powerful, radiant, bursting with love and light. Every note carried not just pain but triumph. The violins wept behind her, the piano echoed her soul, and the choir swelled in harmony. It was as if heaven itself had opened to listen. The audience began to cry within moments. Some held hands, others bowed their heads. Even the harshest judge, the one who had once doubted her, was standing now, hands over his heart, his eyes glistening. Amora's voice rose higher and higher, filling every corner of the auditorium, until the walls themselves seemed to vibrate with emotion. Then, halfway through the song, something happened that no one expected. From the corner of the stage, a side door opened. A hush fell over the room. Two attendants wheeled in a woman, frail, thin, her skin pale but her eyes alive with tears. She wore a hospital gown beneath a shawl, and her trembling hands clutched the armrest. When the camera zoomed in, the world gasped. It was Layla. The music faltered for just a moment as Amora turned her head mid-song. Her voice caught in her throat. Her eyes widened, disbelief flooding her face. "Mama," she whispered, her microphone slipping from her hand. The orchestra stopped. The crowd, realizing what was happening, erupted into cheers and sobs. The host covered his mouth, unable to speak. Amora stood frozen for a second, then she ran. She ran across the stage, the train of her white dress fluttering behind her, and fell to her knees beside the wheelchair. Tears streamed down her face as she buried herself in her mother's arms. The hall filled with the sound of people crying and clapping all at once. Layla, weak but smiling, cupped her daughter's face in trembling hands and whispered, "You sang well enough, my love." The audience stood as one, thousands clapping and shouting her name. The host wiped his tears openly on live television. Cameramen couldn't keep their hands steady. It was more than a reunion. It was a miracle. The next morning, every newspaper in the world had the same headline: "The girl who sang for food finds her mother on live TV." The clip became the most watched moment of the decade. People said it felt like hope itself had walked back into the world. Amora and Layla became symbols of love, faith, and resilience. Months later, Amora released her first single, fittingly titled "A Plate of Hope." It wasn't just a song. It was a story set to melody, the same lullaby but with new words that spoke of healing and strength. The track topped charts around the world. All the profits went into a foundation she created, one dedicated to feeding homeless children and providing music education to those who couldn't afford it. No child should have to sing for food, she said during her first press conference. Reporters asked her what inspired her journey, expecting a poetic answer. Amora simply smiled, looking straight into the camera, her voice calm and certain. It started with hunger, she said, but it ended with love. The world never forgot her, the little girl who turned her hunger into harmony, her pain into purpose, and a stage into a miracle.